Move on to talk about the different type of trade restrictions governments can place to support their domestic industries. We're going to talk about tariffs, quotas, and export subsidies, and there is another type of related restriction which is voluntary export restrictions. Now, why do governments do this? Let's say we talk about the US, where there are local automobile manufacturers like Ford, General Motor, Chrysler, Cadillac, and so on. And then you've got these Japanese companies, Toyota, Honda, etc. So, to protect their local manufacturers, what the US could do is it could put a tariff on Japanese automobiles, so that when the Japanese try to sell their vehicles in the US, it will be more expensive for an American consumer to buy Japanese vehicles, because let's say each of these vehicles is coming for $100, and if there's a 10% tariff, then it will cost 110 to the consumer, versus maybe they can buy the local one for 105. And the local one is still expensive than the Japanese one without the tariff, but with the tariff, the domestic producers become more attractive. So this is how a government can place a tariff to protect the domestic industry. They can also put a quota, which is a limit on the amount of import allowed from Japan. So they can restrict the amount of cars coming in to the US from Japan by putting a quota. As a gesture of goodwill, Japan can itself put something called a voluntary export restraint, which is the same as a quota. The only difference is that, number one, Japan itself is not exporting more than a certain number of cars to the US voluntarily. And the other difference, which we will see when we get to the detailed analysis of quota versus voluntary export restraint, is that in the case of a quota, the US government is controlling this quota. So they actually are going to be able to sell those import licenses, those import quotas, and possibly generate some revenue. But in the case of a voluntary export restraint, the US government won't be able to generate that revenue. And then in the case of export subsidies, that is a different concept, where let's say the US wants to export something back to Japan, and let's take the example of agricultural goods, that to encourage the local farmers in the US to export to the Japan, maybe the US government can give them certain subsidies for export. So we will be looking at that as well. Let's first talk in detail about tariffs. So these are taxes, custom duties to be specific, imposed by the government on imported goods. There are other types of duties as well in addition to custom duties, such as sales tax and federal excise duty, but the main one here is customs duties. And this is for multiple reasons. Number one, I just explained to you that it is done to protect the domestic industry, but it is also a way for the government to generate revenue from its citizens. If it is unable, or it finds it difficult to collect tax from its citizens, then it can just collect tax at the source of import. So that is relatively easier for the government to do in various countries. So why do they levy tariffs? In addition to the point that it's easy for the government to do that and collect tax, it is also, of course, done to protect the domestic industries. It is also done to reduce the demand of imported products by discouraging imports. So if you make imports expensive, then you are discouraging imports, which is going to be good for your trade deficit. What is a trade deficit? A trade deficit is the difference between a country's import and export. So export, if your export is less and your import is more, which means you are buying more from the outside world than you are selling to them, therefore you have a deficit of trade. When a small country puts a tariff, the impact is different on the world versus when a large country puts a tariff. So let's say India, which is of course not a small country, but for a product like luxury bikes, if India is going to put a tariff on luxury bikes like Harley Davidson or Ducati or Triumph, it's not really going to make that much of an impact on the global prices of Harley Davidson, Triumph, and Ducati, because India is not that big a market for them. But if a country like the United States, which is a huge market for automobiles, if they decide to impose a tariff, the manufacturers in Japan are going to start getting worried, because let's say this is the US, and if the US consumers are going to find Japanese vehicles expensive, then the demand for Japanese vehicles will go down. And to offset that, so let's say initially they were selling each one for $100 and there was a 10% tariff, and now it's costing $110 to the US consumer. To make it available to the US consumer for $100, what the Japanese manufacturers will do, they will reduce their original selling price to somewhere around $90. So that even after that 10% extra, it's going to be approximately $100 to the consumers. So when a large country imposes tariffs, the impact on the world price is going to be there. The international prices will go down. How does all of this look in your infographic perspective? So this can get a little complicated. So the way I'm going to explain this is step by step, where first I want to emphasize on this quantity Q1 versus this quantity Q4. And this price, the P with the asterisk, and let's call it $100. Now this is the price at which Japan is willing to sell these cars. Let's say the US says no, we're going to increase the price to $100 so that our local manufacturers can sell more, because this is their domestic supply curve, and as you can see that their domestic manufacturers are not able to supply that much. Beyond $100, up to the price of $100, they can only supply Q1. And at the price of $100, if you take their domestic demand, this is what the American people are demanding, Q4. So Q4 is what the people are demanding at $100 price, and Q1 is what the local industry can supply. So clearly the US government doesn't like this. So what they will do is they will impose some tariff and they will increase the price to $110. Now what will happen after that, that a certain number of US producers, manufacturers will be able to supply at this price, that higher price of $110. So the domestic production goes up from Q1 to Q2, right? So Q2 then becomes the domestic supply. And at this price of 110, as you can see from your domestic demand, that at the higher price, the demand is going to be lower. At the lower price of 100, the demand was Q4. But at the higher price of 110, the demand is now only Q3. And Q3 is still more than Q2. So even though the domestic supply is going up from Q1 to Q2, it is still not able to meet the total demand at 110. So the remaining portion, which is the difference between Q2 and Q3, is going to be imported. There will still be certain cars that are going to be imported at this price. Let's say we're not talking about the US, we're talking about Portugal with a 50% tariff. So then this price is 150. But either way, the concept remains the same, that this area which is B and D is something that the consumers are paying extra, because they could have bought these cars from the imported suppliers at 100, but they are having to pay a higher price for these cars, right? Secondly, this area over here, which is D, is cars that consumers could have bought at the price of 100, but that is also a loss because the demand is going down because the government is raising the price to 150. So these two are loss in welfare. C is also something we could have considered as a loss in welfare if we were talking about it in terms of a quota, and we will talk about it in terms of a quota, but this is not a quota, this is a tariff. And by increasing this price, the way the government is increasing this price is by charging a duty, and this extra money that they are charging on the imported goods, which is the difference between Q2 and Q3, is going to be the revenue earned by the government. So just because it's not completely going to waste, it is coming to the government, so we will not consider this as a loss in welfare. Later you will see that when we talk about quotas instead of tariffs, and we say that there is an import quota, that only this much import is allowed, which is the difference between Q2 and Q3. So therefore, the price will still go up in the case of a quota because the public wants more, but you're giving them less. So the price per good will go up. But that additional amount in the increase of the price is not going to come to the government. It will be going to the country which is sending the goods from outside, Japan in this case. So therefore, that will be included in the loss in welfare from the importing country's perspective. But for the time being, we are not talking about quotas. We are talking about tariffs. And this quantity which is being imported between Q2 and Q3 is going to be giving the government this additional 150 minus 100, which is 50 per unit. And that is not going to be considered as a loss in welfare because that money is going to the government. Now, what is producer surplus? So initially the local producers were supplying only till Q1. Now they are supplying till Q2. And not only are they supplying till Q2, they are now supplying at a higher price, right? So all these guys are actually being able to charge a higher price for this additional quantity. Also, furthermore, the people who were supplying initially at the lower price locally are also now able to charge a higher price. So all of this, the old suppliers are also getting a higher price, and the new suppliers are also able to come in and charge a higher price because the government has increased the price. So this is known as the producer surplus. This whole box is known as the producer surplus, of which this is the old suppliers and these are the new ones that have come in and are able to charge a higher price. The government tariff is denoted by C. We already discussed that. And the consumer surplus decreases. Now, what does that mean? Consumer surplus is basically when you have a supply and demand, and if this is the price which is agreed based on the supply and demand, and let's say that is 100, there are some people who are still willing to pay a higher price, but they don't need to because the market price is agreed at 100. So this whole area is actually called consumer surplus. But in this case, when you increase the price, you're forcing people to pay the higher price and there is a loss of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus decreases when you increase the price. And all these welfare effects you can see in this data below in the graph. And this is important because from an exam perspective, these are the type of questions you can get, that they can ask you to calculate the consumer surplus or the producer surplus or the tariff or the rent, quota rent. Quota rent we will look at in the section where we talk about quotas, but here we're going to look at the tariff revenue, which is C. So let me discuss all of these one by one, because this is important from an exam perspective. The tariff revenue is obviously C, right? This is the local quantity which is going up from Q1 to Q2. The total quantity demanded is coming down from Q4 to Q3. And this remaining portion between Q2 and Q3 is what will be imported, right? And this difference in price for that imported amount is the amount which will go to the government. So that is your tariff revenue. The producer surplus is this box where the old domestic producers are able to charge a higher amount, and so are the new ones. So that is your A. National welfare is going to go down by B and D. Why not all A, B, C and D? Because A is going to the producers. So it's not really going down as at a national level, because even though the consumers are paying higher, but the producers are earning higher. So it's just a transfer of wealth happening from the consumers to the producers. But it's not a national loss. C is also not a national loss, because even though the consumers are paying higher, that money is going to the government. However, B and D are going to be a loss in national welfare, or what we will call dead weight loss, because this business D is just not done. It could have been done. People could have bought these cars at 100, but they are not going to be able to. So all these people, they are not able to buy cars. And B is money which is paid to those producers who are inefficient. They are inefficient. You can easily import cars at $100. So there is no need to make these factories work and produce cars above $100 and sell at $150. So they are inefficient producers that are being brought into production because the government is protecting them. Now, this was an example for a small country like Portugal. Why is that so important? Because if it was the US that was imposing these tariffs, what would happen is that Japan would have to then reduce prices. And if Japan would reduce prices, then the situation would be completely different. That overall, the price at which Japan was initially selling goes down, and then even though the US government is getting a certain tariff, but the price that the consumer pays is still not going up, because Japan will say, okay, I will reduce my price to 90, and US government can take this additional portion on that entire imported segment, which was this whole portion beyond which the locals were not able to supply. So all the import that is beyond the domestic supply will be still there. The only difference is the imported price will be low and the difference will go to the US government. And that is very good for overall national welfare. Right? So the outcome is that the exporting country, which is Japan, will lose, right? But the consumers will gain. Even the consumers of Japan will gain because their prices will be decreased as well. International prices will go down. And US producers will gain because naturally, if the US is increasing its local price even by a little bit, then the local producers will be able to sell more at higher prices. But of course, consumers will lose because they have to pay the higher price. Depends on exactly how much Japan decreases the price. So if the original price is 100, US decides to increase to 110, but Japan decreases the price to 95, right? So the end result will be somewhere around 105, which means the consumers still lose, the local producers still gain. The producers in Japan lose because instead of selling at 100, now they will be selling at 95, right? And the Japanese consumers will gain because they will get it at 95 now, since Japan has decided to reduce the global prices. And all of this might sound a little bit confusing, but hopefully it is going to become very clear once we go through this example. So we're talking about South Africa, and South Africa is manufacturing 110,000 tons of paper locally at 5 ton per. So this is 5 ton price per paper, and this is, let's say, the domestic supply curve of the South African economy, and they can only supply 110,000 tons. But let's say this is the domestic demand, and clearly at that price of $5 per ton, the domestic demand is 200,000 tons, right? So clearly the people in South Africa want a lot more paper at this price. So naturally it will be imported. But instead of importing, what South Africa is doing, it is going to try and reduce the import by imposing a certain tariff. So they put a 20% tariff, which means the price will go up to now 6. Now when the price goes up to 6, the first thing that will happen is that the domestic producers can supply more. Initially they were only able to supply 110K. Now they will be able to supply 130K. So the local supply goes up at the higher price, of course. And secondly, the overall demand will come down. So at this price of 6, the demand now comes down to 170. So now only this much will be imported, between 130 and 170. So what is the first question here? Calculate the loss in consumer surplus arising from the imposition of the tariff. Now, the consumer is going to pay for everything, right? The whole loss is the consumer surplus loss, which is A, B, C, and D. So let's calculate. This is A, right? This small triangle over here is B. This box is C, and then this small triangle over there is D. So let's calculate A, B, and C together. So from here till here is 170, and the difference between these two is 1. So 170 into 1 is obviously going to be 170K. So that's this whole box that we just took out, right? This whole box. 170 into 1. And then D is the difference between 170 and 200K, which is 30,000. And again with the $1. Sorry, it's going to be a triangle, so this will be half, right? D is a triangle, so it will be half. So that is going to be 15,000. So 15,000 plus 170 is 185. Next, calculate the gain in producer surplus. So producer surplus means from 5 to 6, and initially at 5 they were only supplying 110. Now at 6 they are supplying 130. So we've got all of this extra money going to the producers, right? So there's going to be a square over here, or rather a rectangle over here, this rectangle plus this triangle. So this rectangle is going to be 110 multiplied by 1, and then the additional 20,000 multiplied by 1 and multiplied by half. So 110 multiplied by 1, and then the additional 20,000 multiplied by 1 and multiplied by half, and that is of course the whole area A, where these are the old ones and these are the new ones. All right, third question, what is the gain in government revenue? So again, from 5 to 6, domestic supply going from 110 to 130, your demand going down from 200k to 170, right? But this difference between 130 and 170 is still going to be imported, and the government is going to get that. So let me draw a better diagram. So demand, supply, old and new, right? Old and new. So it will be going from 110 to 130, the local supply, total demand coming down from 200 to 170. This will be the imported one, which is between 130 and 170. And this box in the middle, which is your C, is going to be the revenue going to the government. So that is 170 minus 130 is 40k multiplied by that $1. So this should be 40,000 multiplied by 1, which is 40,000, which is C. All right, dead weight loss. So again, with your diagram, demand, supply, old, new, and the dead weight loss is going to be, well, A is not going to be in the dead weight loss because that's going to the producers. B is going to be in the dead weight loss. C is not going to be in the dead weight loss here because that's going to the government. D is going to be in the dead weight loss because that is business loss. So between 200k and 170k, the 200 minus 170 is 30. But D is a triangle, so we need to half that. And this will also be multiplied by the $1 difference, right? And B is from 110 to 130. So that is a difference of 130 minus 110 is equal to 20. Again, this will be divided by 2 because B is also a triangle, multiplied by $1. So it's basically 10,000 plus 15,000. So that is 10 plus 15 is going to be 25, right? So this 20,000, which is the difference between 130 and 110 multiplied by 1.5, and 30,000, which is the difference between 200 and 170 multiplied by 1.5, which are the B and D areas. But this is for a tariff. Why we're not taking C here is because that's money going to the government, so it's not really a dead weight loss. And we're not taking A here is because that money is going to the local producers, so again, not really a complete loss. But if this was a quota and this C in the middle was not revenue coming to the government, then we would consider it putting in the dead weight loss. And this brings us to our discussion about quotas. So instead of putting a tariff on the imports, what the government could do is they could just put a restriction on the quantity of import, right? We could put a restriction on the quantity of import, and it's not a complete loss in terms of the revenue. Depends how the government decides to play it, right? It can either just not charge anything for whoever is going to get that quota. It could just give it to Toyota, or it could give it to some local importer, right? Or it could charge like a licensing fee for that. So that is a very delicate area. Of course, the question will tell you whether the government is charging a fee for that or not. Because if it is charging a fee, then it is getting a certain revenue. And if not, then it's not. But either way, what's important over here is that this center part over here, C, is quota rent. And if the government is not really charging anything for that quota rent, then C becomes part of the loss in welfare. This is the main difference in tariff and quota, right? So at first glance, tariff and quotas look similar, but there is a subtle difference. And that is, number one, that this C is your, in the case of your tariff, it is revenue earned by the government. But in the case of a quota, obviously, there is no revenue earned by the government. And this will get added to your welfare loss if the government is not charging anything in terms of import licenses. Now, as I explained to you that some countries will voluntarily put an export restraint. So, and a practical example is the US and Japan, that before the US puts a quota on it or puts tariffs on Japan, Japan itself could say, hey, okay, we realize that we are killing your local industry of Ford and GM and Chrysler and all this. So we're just going to stop our import or put a voluntary export restraint on it. Now, in this case, obviously, the US government is not going to get any additional revenue, right? There is no additional revenue. And this is a true story. From the 1981 to 1994, there was an example of this, which was restricted to 1.68 million cars going from Japan to the US. Right. Next, export subsidies. Now, this is for a country to try and increase its trade surplus or try and reduce its trade deficit by increasing its exports and trying to offset the imports that it has. And how they do it is they try to subsidize their exports. They give the producers extra money for exporting a certain good. And it's very good for the firm that is exporting because they get this extra incentive, right? Not only do they get the international price, but they get a per unit subsidy as well. And a very common example is agriculture, especially if you talk about Europe and sugar. And again, here it depends if you're a small country or a large country, because if the small country is importing export subsidies, the only impact that is going to happen is to their own people, because instead of supplying to the local people, the let's say there is a sugar mill in a small country, and instead of giving the sugar to its local people, it will start exporting because they're getting a certain extra money for exporting. So local people will have to compete with the international market and pay higher prices to offset this subsidy. So the domestic prices will rise. On the other hand, if a large country does this, then the whole world's prices will decline because of that large country's government subsidizing it. And you have an example of the European Union subsidizing sugar. And it is the second largest exporter in the world. What happens to net welfare? Well, regardless whether you are large or small, the welfare will be down because the government is paying for it outright. And the benefit is obviously coming to people outside the country. Now, what is really important is to know all these effects, that when is the welfare positive, when is the welfare negative. And the good news is that there are very nice exhibits that are there in your curriculum, which I will be showing you now. And you just need to know and remember these ones, because this is the type of questions that you can get as well. And they are summarizing all these effects. So let me walk you through them. So first of all, with tariffs, the local producers are happy. They can sell at a higher price. They're getting a surplus. The consumers, unfortunately, are sad in all situations, right? The producers are happy in all situations because they get to sell at a higher price in tariffs. They get to sell at a higher price in quotas. They get to sell at a higher price in voluntary export restraints. And exporters who are producers get to sell, they get extra money. So they are happy in all situations, and the consumers are the ones who lose. But the national welfare is not the same in all. Because in the case of a tariff, if it's a small country, then Japan and US example, Japan will not lower its prices if a small country is importing a tariff. So national welfare, there will be a decrease. In the case of Portugal, if Portugal increases, puts a 50% tariff, then Japan will not decrease international prices just for Portugal. So Portugal people will lose, national welfare will be lost. However, because of the deadweight loss, this happens because of the B and C, which is your deadweight loss, that inefficient producers will come into play within Portugal, and a certain number of consumers will be unable to buy, which is that D triangle. But if US a country as large as US is going to impose tariffs, then Japan will be forced to reduce the prices, and in that case there could actually be an increase in the national welfare of the US, right? In the case of a import quota, the same situation is there, that for a small country the welfare decreases because of the deadweight loss, and here the deadweight loss will be even bigger, right? Because you've got B plus C plus D, because the government is not even getting that tariff. And it could be large in the case of a large country. It could be a positive increase in the national welfare if the large country is putting a quota, because the exporting country will have to reduce the prices. But in the case of a voluntary export restraint, there is a loss in national welfare, because you are not getting any additional revenue, and the exporting country is voluntarily restricting its export, so they are probably going to charge higher prices instead of lowering prices, and your country is not going to benefit. Even in the case of an export subsidy, overall national welfare is lost, because you are sending out cheaper products to the world and you are actually paying for that discount yourself. Now coming to the government revenue, in the case of a tariff, of course, it goes up. In the case of a subsidy, it goes down. No brainer over there. In the case of a voluntary export restraint, there is no change, because the local government is not doing anything. The only confusion over here could be in the import quota, and that depends. If you are generating some money through the sale of licenses of those import quotas, then you could be generating some revenue. There could be some increase in revenue, otherwise not. And the impact on prices is going to increase everywhere, right? If you put tariff, price will go up. If you put quota, price will go up. If you put export subsidy, local prices will go up, especially if it's a small country. And when there is a voluntary export restraint, prices will go up because of short supply. Domestic consumption will obviously decrease in all situations because prices are going up. The locals will benefit for sure, and that is why governments do this, right? All of this protectionary policies is there to protect your domestic production, so they will benefit in all situations. And unfortunately, from a global trade perspective, imports go down with tariffs and with quotas and with voluntary export restraints. Export subsidies, of course, will increase your exports. So we're going to finish off this video with an example from your curriculum, which has 6 parts. And we're going to discuss all these 6 parts together. So let's start with the first one, that Thailand is a small country and has decided to import a tariff or a quota on the import of computers, and you are looking to invest in a local firm which is an importer of computers. So naturally, if a tariff is placed or a quota is placed, the business of this firm in which you are investing or looking to invest in is going to get impacted. Now the first question here is, what will be the impact of a tariff on prices and quantity produced and quantity imported in Thailand? Now you know that if prices are going to go up, first of all, the local quantity produced will be going up, right? And we looked at data like 110 and 130 in the previous example. The quantity imported will be reduced. First of all, the demand goes down. Overall demand goes down because the price is going up. So the overall quantity imported will be going down and the prices will be going up. So prices will be going up, quantity produced locally will be going up, and quantity imported will be going down. So prices will go up, quantity imported goes down, and domestic production goes up. Next one, if they impose a tariff, what will be the impact on prices in the exporting country? Now, Thailand is a small country, right? Just because Thailand is importing a tariff, let's say it's South Korea or Japan that is exporting, or China that is exporting computers, they're not going to reduce the prices, international prices, because of Thailand. So because it's a small country, they will be no change by the exporting country, which is probably going to be China in this case. How would a tariff affect consumer surplus? Obviously, consumer surplus is going to be badly affected by both A plus B, all for C plus D, right? Because this goes to producer surplus, this is deadweight loss, this is going to the government, and this is also deadweight loss. So all of this is going to be gone. Producer surplus is A, government is C. So government revenue will go up, producer surplus will go up, consumer surplus will come down. All of this is negative for consumer surplus. So consumer surplus goes down, producer surplus goes up, and government revenue also goes up. All right. Effect of net welfare. Well, we know that's going to be bad, right? There is deadweight loss of B and C. And let me draw it and show you. So this triangle over here, which is B, and this triangle over here, which is D. So why D is deadweight loss? Because people could have bought those computers, but they will not at the high price. So that's why D is a deadweight loss. And C is basically people having to pay higher prices and buy computers from local production, which is inefficient. They could have paid a lower price and got imported products at a lower price, maybe even better quality, right? But they're having to buy from these local producers at a higher price, and they might not even be efficient. So definitely welfare is going to be lost. Now that's because this is a small country. If this was the US imposing this tariff, it's possible that China might have lowered its prices, and overall it might have become a welfare gain than a loss, right? But here obviously China is not going to lower international prices, and it will be a welfare loss for Thailand, which is going to be B and D, not C. C is obviously not included in your welfare loss because the government is getting that money, and A is not included because the local producers are getting it. So it's not a complete loss. I mean, the consumers are paying for it, so it is included in the loss of consumer surplus, but that money is either going to the producers or the government, so it is not a deadweight loss. But B and D is definitely a loss in national welfare. Okay, so which policy, a tariff or a quota, will be beneficial to the local importer in which you are looking to invest? This is an interesting question, and depends if the party that you're looking to invest in can get a piece of that quota or not, right? So quota could be good for them if they can get some of that quota. So a tariff will definitely hurt importers for sure because they will reduce their share of the market. Number one, because the overall demand will go down, and number two, from the remaining demand, some of that will be taken up by the inefficient local producers who can then sell at a higher price. So overall business of importers will be going down. So definitely tariff is bad. Quota could be not that bad if they can capture a share of the quota, right? And that's probably going to be through a licensing process, and some of these emerging markets are difficult to navigate in terms of landing those permits and licenses. Okay, number 6 and the last part of this example. If Thailand were to negotiate a voluntary export restriction from the countries exporting, let's say that is China, then would this be better or worse? Definitely worse. Definitely worse, because at least with the quota you have a chance of getting the license. The company in which you are investing, the importer of computers, they have a chance of getting in on this license and getting some of that quota. So that will be good for their business. But if you're going for a voluntary export, if Thailand government is going for a voluntary export restraint, then there is no hope for this importer of computers. Don't invest in that company in that case, of course. So the VER would not be better for the local importer, because if your import quota is not there, then under the VER, directly the Chinese exporters are going to come in and just dump their equipment in the market, and your importer is not going to get anything of that. So that is it for section 3 over here and all these different trade policies. In the next video, we'll take up section 4 and talk about the trading blocks and regional integration.